So welcome, everybody. For those who didn't meet me yesterday, I'm Karen Mundy, and I'm the president-elect of the Comparative and International Education Society. You can't hear? Oh, gee. Okay, good. I'm Karen Mundy. I am the president-elect of the Comparative Education Society and a professor and associate dean at the University of Toronto. One of the few honors that a president or incoming president has is selecting the annual Kneller Lecture. And this year, I'm very, very pleased to have been able to secure for us a talk from Rukmini Banerji. Those of you who don't know her work, Rukmini began, as she told me in an email exchange, with her studies in Chicago, and at that time became very, very interested in the lives of schools and schooling. And she later went on to become an innovator, a leader, and I think somebody with both a level of ambition for changing and reforming educational systems that's uniquely balanced with a level of humility and an ability to listen. She has, of course, developed the ACER platform, the Annual Status of Education Report platform that has become world-renowned for its innovation in linking citizens and accountability to improvement in the quality of schooling. And her work with ACER has been scaled up or replicated in many other countries around the world. It's a nice counterpoint to our presidential lecture yesterday to note that our president, Gilberto Valverde, studied with Rukmini in Chicago. So Rukmini is going to give us a very different view, I think, of accountability politics, one that is less about the global forces driving accountability and more about the kinds of citizenship and civil society interventions that might utilize accountability in ways that yields real change on behalf of children. I'm delighted to have Rukmini with us. We'll be followed, she'll give her lecture, and we'll be followed by a panel of civil society actors discussing, uniquely, I think for some of us, the Millennium Development Goals from a Southern or a civil society perspective. So please join me in welcoming Rukmini. I'm really happy that she could come.
Thank you, Karen. As you know, in India, we're heading into general elections. And in case I stood for political office, here is my campaign manager. I'm really very honored to be here. I think in the last 30 years, I've been to CIES conference once. This is my second time. And the previous time when I went, it was so small that I think you could have it like in a Best Western or a little hotel. So it's wonderful to see this whole family just growing and growing. I think I share something with your president. We both went to the same graduate school, which after we finished was shut down. I don't know what exactly that means, but you always have to explain that you went to a graduate school that does not exist anymore. So perhaps it's just a good thing that I'm not a researcher anymore and not an academic, but it's really a privilege to be here. Many of my colleagues back home who are very forthright said to me, "You're going to give a lecture? Like on what?" And I took Karen's words literally. She said, talk about whatever you feel like. Don't make it sound like a conference presentation. And since the last 2 days, we've been trained very well to stop talking in 12 minutes and not go over time. So this is indeed an honor to be able to actually have some time to talk to everybody here. What I thought I would do is kind of just take you through a couple of learnings that we as an organization in India have had. And luckily for me, and I didn't think this would happen so far away from home, there are people in this room who've been parts of some of those journeys. So if nothing else, I hope to be able to amuse some of my friends in the audience and see if their recollections match mine, and if we learned the same things together or if there were different learnings. So as Karen said, I started my professional life in Chicago. And I was like many usual graduate students. In India, you're expected to sort of do all your education for years. So I guess I have 27 years of education. And after you finish doing all the degrees at home, then you go abroad to do some more degrees. And so, I did that. Luckily for me, I didn't get financial aid in the economics department at the University of Chicago, because if I had, I would have probably gone a different route. I had admission in the education department. And I have to thank both Chicago and the department for really bringing my interest into schools in a way that I certainly didn't have when I was back in India. At the time, this was the mid-80s. There was a lot of things going on in Chicago school reform. I lived in a neighborhood that was deeply involved in the goings-ons of the schools. And again, coming from India, where you are very interested in education, but you don't have those kinds of neighborhood links, I think it was a big education for me to just be in Chicago at a time when these community links with schools were being revitalized, rethought, reviewed, and the universities played a major role in, I think, those relationships as well. But in addition, I kept feeling that I was missing out on the action on the ground. You have this impression when you're in school that all the action is somewhere else. I don't know if that is true or not, but I decided that I should go and experience what is happening in Chicago schools myself. What was the way to do that? So I walked, for those of you who are familiar with Chicago, the university is in the South Side. And in those days, people said South Side with more significance than they do now, because much has been gentrified in the city, I think, since then. And so I walked a couple of blocks further south to the nearest school that I could find. And I walked in, and people were quite surprised. I guess you don't have walk-ins in those kinds of schools. And I offered myself. And the principal was very kind. And he had a nice chat with me, and he said, "Why don't you come back?" And I did this trip 2 or 3 times. And finally he said, "Frankly, we don't know what to do with you. So what would you like to do?" And so I ended up actually doing some volunteer work, actually teaching. Very soon I was actually taking a class 3 times a week for 7th graders in this school on the south side of Chicago. And I think it is that experience really that got me really thinking about what our schools in India would be like. I had had no such urge while I lived in India to walk into my neighborhood school and offer myself in any form. And yet, while doing that in Chicago, I learned a lot. One of the things I learned was that the kids simply couldn't place me. They said, "You're not white." So clearly. "But you're not black." "No." "Are you German?" Are you something else? And so, we struggled for 2 years with the 7th grade, and finally they decided, well, whatever, you're Miss Banerji. It doesn't matter, I don't need to. I taught them writing composition, and I think I had insights into these children's minds in a way that perhaps if I had taught physics or chemistry, I wouldn't have. And we had these very interesting discussions in the class, and I still remember this young boy who in 7th grade already had a personality, and his personality was to be the bad boy. And one day they had to write, I forget what, but he actually wrote a poem, and the poem was really touching. And I made perhaps the mistake of reading out the poem in class and asking the children to guess who wrote it. And through this whole process, when it was discovered that this young man, who was clearly wanted to be the bad boy of the neighborhood, could actually be a poet, it caused a lot of confusion for everyone, because it was somehow crossing boundaries of the type that neither the boy intended to and neither his friends. But I think through the kids and through the community of that school, it gave me a real insight into the issues of urban education, into personal lives, into the roles that the teachers had to play in communities of that sort. And frankly, I wish I could go back to the school. I wonder if any of them are still there, to thank them for the fact that it really raised in me the curiosity for really getting into schools into India. It's a bit of a roundabout route to get into schools in India, but I'm glad that I was made to see and be curious about these things. So after my many years of education, I returned to India. And having come from Chicago and seen what the Chicago Public School System's research department was up to, I imagined that I could go to Bombay, now called Mumbai, and go into their municipal school system, which was roughly the same size as Chicago, and see if I could belong to their research department. So first I spent a week looking for the Bombay Municipal School Research Department and came to the conclusion there was one, and there was one person in it. And when I went to meet her, she was deeply suspicious of me because I think she thought I wanted her job. In the end, I could see that there was really no place that you could come into. There was no job, and there was no way to get into what would be one of India's biggest school systems. And it's around that time, the organization that I work for now, Pratham, was just starting. And the mandate of Pratham was to work very closely with the school system, and that's where I started. And I realized as I worked with Pratham in those early years, that really all those years of education had to be put aside in some way, and had to start getting educated all over again. And so I have to thank Pratham as well for my first lessons, which were really in the slums of Bombay. This was around 1996. The millennium year was still far away. And I think at the time the organization was coming together, there was a mandate to work with the school system. And the goal was every child in school and learning. And we worked a number of ways, and one of the things we could see as a new outfit, that while the school system had gaps, had deficiencies, but perhaps the place for a new set of people with not very many resources to begin was in the early childhood space. Lots of migrants into the city, dislocated families, people who are trying to get their roots. And in this big shuffle of coming into a very big city, crowded city, a difficult city, children would often get lost. And so perhaps starting with early childhood centers was the place to begin, because our view was that if every child had the opportunity to go to some kind of a preschool, universal first grade could be guaranteed. And so that's where we started. Being not a native speaker of Marathi, which is the local language there, I was sent to an area, and also everybody knew that I was way overeducated, so I needed some serious education quickly. So I was sent to one of the larger slums, which had a lot of Hindi-speaking people, because then I could communicate directly. And one of my first assignments was to work in this very large and very new slum, which for those, there must be people in this room who are familiar with Bombay. It is on the way from Bombay to Pune, and it is where all of Bombay's garbage is dumped. And so it is on the edge of this huge garbage dump that my first assignment was. But I wasn't alone. Unlike in graduate school where you are alone, here you had a team to work with, and there were always people who were teaching you all the time. And because I didn't know Marathi very well, all my colleagues felt that I needed some accelerated learning at all times. And I even remember a young colleague saying to me, "Where have you been all these years? You haven't even learned the right language." The young woman with whom I worked at the time, I remember her very, very well. Her name was Ghazala. And our job, hers mainly, and mine to support her, was to see whether we could set up little community-based preschools in that slum, so that every child in that kind of space of about, I don't have a good sense of space, but there were about 500 households in that area. And could we have enough little preschools to cater to all the children between the ages of 3 to 5 in that area? And over a period of a couple of months, we were able to find young women who were right from that community, who were willing to hold these little preschools wherever they could find space. And most people here didn't even have a roof over their head. It was all under plastic sheets. And so many of our preschool centers were exactly in places like that. Very soon we had about 30 centers running, each of whom had 15 or 20 little kids. We couldn't have more than that because the spaces were really little. And it had to be where the kids could walk by themselves. This young girl, Ghazala, at one point, once these little preschools were set up, said to me, "I have a problem. I don't like the fact that many of our kids don't have proper clothes. So what do you think? Can you do anything about it?" Now this would be 30 little preschool centers with at least 20 kids in each of them, which meant providing for clothing for hundreds of children. Certainly wasn't part of what we could do. And I very frankly said to her, I don't think we can do that. She looked a little disappointed that I was so-called her superior and didn't have any solutions. 2 weeks later, she came back and she said to me, the problem is solved. How did you solve the problem? She herself came from a slum which was just a little bit further away, not as badly off as the people that she was in charge of, but not incredibly much better off. And so she said, I went to my neighborhood and I told everybody, this is terrible. We have almost 500 kids. They need clothes. So come on, everybody, give me some. And she was able, single-handedly, to provide clothing, at least for the children, maybe not all 500, but for those who didn't have at least some clothes. And I think this led to some confidence in her own ability to go beyond the mandate that she was given. A couple of weeks later or months later, she said to me again, so now they have clothes. But you know, if this is preschool, and you guys call it preschool, they should have a uniform. I said, okay. She also said, I know you can't help me. So I will organize this myself. I just thought I should keep you in the know because for some reason you seem interested in what I'm doing. And so what she did was she got the phone number of the local politician and she called him, took a couple of tries to call him, and she told him the same thing, that these are people in your constituency and they need uniforms. Now, whether the politician actually provided the uniforms or not, she spoke to enough people and was able to get some amount of fabric, which she then converted into little uniforms for these kids. So we have these children in these uniforms going to little preschool centers under plastic sheets. But I think what it did was, it convinced girls like Ghazala, who were really products of the local community and of the local school, that they could do quite a lot. And it convinced all the others who were in her purview that if they all got together, they too could do a lot. And all it needed was some people strongly wanting to do something, and there could be more that could come. These kinds of efforts were not unique. At the time in Bombay when I joined Pratham, and Pratham was quite new, we had 150 little preschool centers. And to me, it's very interesting because we thought we were large scale at the time. 150 preschool centers. There was no other organization in Bombay at the time that was running that many centers. From 96 to 98, women like Ghazala and others from neighboring slums, through the friends and family network, all came forward to say, we think that this little preschool is a good idea. I mean, literally the preschool was a person and some children and some space who actually did some little activities. It was literally that. Some people have said, so did you run like a Head Start program? I don't think so. This was exactly what it was. And people would come forth to say that we too want such things in our neighborhood. And we moved from 150 to 3,500 within a space of 2 years. And it all happened partly because people wanted that this should happen in their neighborhood. We had an evaluation of somebody who came from a well-known agency that does early childhood education, who said that these preschool centers are not appropriate for children. Well, much of Bombay is not appropriate for anyone. And so in those situations, do you say we will not have these and wait for this perfect little preschool setting, or do you go ahead with what the community can do and what the community can support? And I think that so we were scale when we were 150, we were on scale when we were 3,500, and I've always been puzzled by what this scale means. I think scale means just one step ahead from where you are today. I'm looking at Ward here, and Ward remembers visiting some of these areas way back then. Soon this entire preschool network around Bombay began to surface many other kinds of needs. So communities, parents, especially moms would say, you're doing a lot for these little babies, but what about our kids who are in school? What about the kids who are not in school? What are you going to do for those? And I think willy-nilly we were pushed into thinking about what to do just because there was such a loud voice coming. And partly like Ghazala, people believed that maybe you could help. And partly just by telling you, they could organize their own thoughts better. So in a way, you acted like a sounding board or a platform. And sometimes you were a sounding board, and sometimes you were not very useful. But through many of these efforts grew a larger program, which we worked with the Bombay municipal system to really think about how do you operationalize this every child in school and learning. There were still a lot of out-of-school children in those days, children who were not yet enrolled. And from communities like the ones I've described, often it was because they had just moved from the village to the city. They hadn't yet got their moorings right. They needed some help in being linked in the right places. Sometimes the languages were misaligned. And so there was a room for mediating this space between families and communities and the school system. And at the time, the school system as well could see that this was something that needed to be done by people who were attached and associated with the school system, but not necessarily part of it. Same community, and I wish we could have a movie about it rather than just hear the talk, because it was very visually compelling as well. In the same area that we had these, the Ghazala little preschools, there was a school. In fact, Ghazala was a product of that school. And I remember the principal of that school being shocked that this girl, who was not a particularly fine product of the school, was actually become a leader who came out of this whole process. And I've often wondered that when we actually in Pratham look for people, if there was a way, rather than a CV which said what educational qualifications you had, if somebody would list out all the things you didn't do, then we would be able to hire them. Because often those are the ones who go much further than the ones who, like me, had many years of education but needed to start all over again. So in that area, imagine that all those children who were in the preschools would now need to go to school. In addition, they had older brothers and sisters who needed to go to school as well. And if I remember correctly, when we did surveys for just that one community, we had about another 300 or 400 children who were of primary school age who needed to be taken into school. Of course, they needed to be prepared and brought up to some kind of a level before they could be brought in. So conducted a meeting in that local school. The local school already had class sizes of 80 or 90 or 100 kids. They already couldn't fit everybody into the space that they had. And this was literally the only solid building, permanent building, that was on the edge of this garbage dump. Everything else was in a shanty, housing that was plastic or bamboo or so on. And so when we had this meeting, and I remember going into this meeting very confidently, thinking that this could be one of the schools into which the largest number of out-of-school children could come, the principal, with whom also I've had a long association after that, she heard me out and she said, "Don't tell me all this, I'm going to call a staff meeting. How about you talk to my entire set of teachers?" And I felt like, oh good, we've made an inroad. Not only does she want to support this process, but she wants her entire staff and her whole team to be along. The schools in Bombay run in 2 shifts, morning and evening, to be able to maximize the space. And so the meeting that we had of the teachers had 30 teachers. And when I said to them, I'm going to bring you, for sure, another 400 or 500 kids, the teachers were up in arms. They said, not only do we not want those kids, we want you to take away some of the kids we have. Because we have no place to fit them in, we have no resources, we have nobody who actually supports us. We are just used like a dumping ground for every child that is in the vicinity without any thought of how do you actually deliver education. And so went on a long process, and the negotiations that we reached is that at least the children that we bring you will have a certain level of learning. Now, one of the reasons, and I'm sure in this conference we've heard lots and lots about the importance of bringing learning to the center of the stage. I think one of the main reasons is everybody likes a child who's able to do something. Parents like them because you feel they're moving ahead. Teachers really like children who are learning and can learn because they're a lot easier to teach than those who don't want to learn or are not learning. And children themselves feel highly energized and empowered when they know that they are learning. And so our promise to the school was at least the children that we bring you will they will not come as they are today. We will prepare them, and maybe not at the grade level, because almost nobody is at grade level in India. And I discovered after my PhD, neither was I. But we will bring you at a level that at least they will be ready to learn and probably have the basics. And so after several staff meetings, lots of skepticism, great deal of cynicism, The school said, fine, let's see what you can do. And you have 6 months in which to get these children ready. In that whole neighborhood, we then decided that apart from the preschools, which needed to be very close to where the children lived, because when you're 3 years old, you need to be able to walk down, your lane to your preschool. But for these older children, what we called in India bridge classes, to be able to bridge them into school, we needed something more. And talking to the community leaders in that area, they also decided that that needs to be a little bit more, a space that's a little bit more suitable for bringing more children in. So a space was found right in the middle of this slum that was empty. And soon, within about 2 weeks, a structure was constructed on top of that space. We need a structure because during the monsoons, it's difficult to operate in Bombay outside. And it was about a space that was 20 feet by 20 feet. Plastic and bamboos were donated. Everybody had a little bit of extra. And in fact, somebody in that community decided it's worth paving the floor because then children can sit on a floor that is actually cemented and not of mud. I remember I was approached by the local electrician who said, well, if you've built this space, you'd like to work in it at night as well. I hadn't thought of that. I said, yes, good idea. So he said, I will give you electricity. Electricity in Bombay slums, for the unauthorized slums, you have to get electricity. It doesn't come to you. And so I said, okay, what will it cost? He said it won't cost anything to you, to the center, because when I pull the wire from the mains, it will go over many huts. And I will charge them 50 rupees for each bulb. So by the time it comes to you, actually the work that I'll have done will have subsidized. So he had a very good cost model for how to supply electricity to this place. And at the time, I thought this was a great solution. But much later, I happened to be with a group of possible donors who were the Bombay Electric Supply Corporation. And when they had a look at what was going on here, they were very torn about whether to support efforts like these or to just say that they would walk away. So anyway, this thing was built and we ran with, again, community teachers. We ran a number of classes that could take care of these 300 to 400 children, get them ready over the next couple of months to have them enter into school. And this whole community center actually took on a life of its own. People began to use it in their own ways. Every time I went there, which was at least a couple of times a week, I would see different pictures on the walls. Everybody brought their own gods. In India, we have our own gods. And it didn't matter if the gods who were sitting next to each other were from different religions, because, if you can coexist with each other in the slums, then the gods can coexist with each other on the walls. And it actually took on the shape of a community center in a way that we had not really planned or thought. Story doesn't end there. I don't know how much time we have. We can go on and on. But 20 minutes, okay. I have to get to the end of the story because it's a bit like a thriller. One day, which is common in Bombay slums, very often the city bulldozes the unauthorized slums. They bring in their bulldozers and they crush everything. This is the strategy that the city uses for discouraging illegal occupation of areas that people should not be building anything in. And so I was in the area, not in this particular slum, when somebody came running to me to say that that entire area is being bulldozed. And lo and behold, when we arrived there, it was really like a war zone, where these huge machines, all these men in kind of, not quite uniform, but you could tell they were from the city, who were actually just simply flattening everything that was in the way. And the really tragic thing there was that children in that area were very used to their homes being bulldozed. But they were very upset at their school being bulldozed. And they said to me, our homes have been bulldozed before, but this is our school. Can you tell them to just leave the school and just go around it? One woman who had been a very strong supporter of what we did could see how upset I was. And I will never forget, she took me aside. Her home had just been bulldozed. She had already rigged up a little stove. And in India, we feel you must drink tea. That will restore your spirits no matter what. And she actually, in the middle of this mess, made me a cup of tea and said, you are clearly not used to these things. Have a cup of tea. A solution will emerge later. All of this was very upsetting to the immediate community and to the people who were involved. but it's not like it created a big wave in the city. These things happen in big cities. And if you look at it from the point of view of the city government, keeping areas like this, not occupied by illegal people is probably a good idea. But it did create some ripples, because I think that the effort that was underlying all of this was not going unnoticed. So I was summoned to a meeting in the local office of the city administration, the regional office for the area. And when I went for the meeting, I wasn't sure what the agenda would be. And the chief administrative officer, I think, just wanted to kind of make sure that, just reach out a hand of friendship, or I'm not sure what, because when we arrived and sat down, there wasn't really anything to talk about. So I said, okay, now that you've bulldozed this area, people don't actually go away. You know that, and we know that. And he said, yes. And they will rebuild. And so came the question about all these children who have to be now enrolled in the school, because that was a part of the city program. It wasn't just something that Pratham was running. And he called members of the people who were in charge of demolition in that area, and who were also sitting in the meeting. And the guys who were in charge of the demolition were very kind of not comfortable. And they said to me, why are you asking us for solutions? We are the demolition squad. We're just doing our job. Our job is not to provide solutions. Our job is to just get rid of everything. And as we talked, one of them said, okay, I have an idea. You see, when we demolish things, a lot of the material, the bamboos and other, the tin strips, we don't actually crush them. We put them away. Would you like some of those? We will build another school for you in a place which is slightly less unauthorized. Now, this was a huge gesture on part of the demolition department. But it was like making a pact with the devil in some way. And everybody in the room was grateful that people were beginning to think, but that this was not quite the right solution. And to cut a long story short, the school that I spoke to you about became the center of attention, because that was a government space. They did have a little yard. And what it led was really to more construction of rooms and going higher on the space that they had. And all of this, I think, in the early days taught us that this policy, local action, community mobilization, all of these, when you see it at a local level, mesh together in ways that I think come up with strategies which are clearly out of the box. But you need to push each other to reach solutions that perhaps are not comfortable for everyone, but are maybe slightly better off than the solutions that you had before. And I think in that way as well, the next set of demolitions didn't happen very soon. I'm sure they did a couple of years later. But there was something about the work that had gone on, and I think it wouldn't have happened if the work had been dealing only with a few children. The fact that it dealt with, in the preschools, 500-600 children, some older children, the involvement of the school, some of that, I think, did play a role in coming up with strategies that could be a little bit more sustaining over a period of time. These kinds of experiences, I think, taught us all that you need to keep pushing. Don't push so hard that people have to just run away from you or push you back. But if you keep pushing at different levels, some things will emerge, more resources arrive, and solutions can be found if you agree that the overall goal is a goal that's worth achieving. So in re-envisioning education, perhaps that is something that we all need to do, is to keep pushing on the places that we can comfortably push with and make sure that we can sort of take... I want to bring one rural example in as well. This also happened almost 10 years ago. It is from my own home state, which is one of the most backward states in the country. It used to be one of the most educationally backward states in the country. Had a period of political rule which was extremely negative for at least education. No teachers were hired for almost 20 years. And around about 10 years ago, 2004, there was a move from the government side to recruit what we in India call para-teachers. About 80,000 para-teachers were going to be recruited to be brought into the schools. And at that point, we got a phone call from, by this time we had started working in many parts of India, and we got a phone call from the person who headed the education department there, who had heard about the kinds of reading techniques we used and the assessment methods we had. And he called and invited us to a conference and said, I want to understand how you assess learning. So we told him how we assess learning, and it's quite straightforward. And he said, I would like that assessment to happen in the state of Bihar. So at this point I said, but to what end? I mean, we can assess. Thermometers are always useful, but what are you hoping to find? And is there likely to be any change? The conversation started with assessment, but it very soon moved to the fact that they were going to recruit all these teachers. And so one of the things we said is, what if you did the assessment before the teachers arrived? The state had about 150,000 teachers. You were going to now insert another 80,000 teachers. You would expect that some changes would happen simply from the availability of more teachers in the system. And as the conversations moved, it moved further away and away from the opening reason for having the conversation to, so what can you do to help to improve the learning? We were quite large, but we were not a very resource-rich organization. And what it turned out was that to train these 80,000 contract teachers, the state was preparing 6,000 trainers. And these 6,000 trainers were going to be put into a training program to become trainer of trainers kind of training in 150 locations for 10 days. After which they would scatter all over the state and then proceed to do whatever they had to do. So it seemed like those 10 days were an important point to get in. And we said that I think what we'd like to do is to be with you for those 10 days, and if it's possible, to find some time to actually talk about the methods that we use. The state government said our sessions are all set. At least in India, we have these very set, structured sessions. And they're all printed into little booklets and every session is marked. So that's all done. So we said, do you have lunch times? We always have lunch times. We always have lunch times and tea times. They often are longer than the actual sessions. So our deal was, what we'd like to do is in each of these locations where the master trainers were being trained, we'd like to step out of the building into nearby schools for an hour with the master trainers so that we could practice whatever it is about the learning method that we were saying. To the state sitting in the state capital, it seemed fine because it didn't seem like a big movement away from what had been planned. But there were 150 locations in the state in which this was supposed to happen. So how are we going to reach them all? I got back to my own colleagues and we had a board meeting, I remember, at the time. And so to the board, I made a presentation saying, most backward state in India, opportunity to introduce a way to improve learning, we need 300 people to go to Bihar. Rightly, the president of our board said, and the government wants you to go? We said yes, which was kind of true. So why are they paying for it? Well, governments in India have money, but often this money cannot move easily. And so I said, they really want us to come, they're not able to pay. So the board looked at me like, oh, okay. And so you want to use the money that we have to take people across the country into 150 locations for something that is not entirely clear what it's going to lead to. So, to put it in a nutshell, they were not very keen that we should carry out this effort. However, by this time, the word had spread within the Pratham network. And like my friend Ghazala, I think this is universal that young people are looking for adventure and action. I started getting phone calls saying, how much money will it cost? We'll get into a train. If needed, we'll pay for the ticket. We'll get to the state, we'll go to the location, and then somebody will take care of us. And within about 10 days, more than 300 people across Pratham volunteered to make this journey. And believe me, in those days, this was like the Badlands of India. You didn't just go there, looking for action. You got the action when you reached there. Or at least this was the perception in much of India that this is what the condition was. Today, it's a lot better because of many things that the governments have done. So we had these 300 young people arrived. 60 or 75% were young women. We put a criteria saying that they have to know Hindi. They have to have permission from their parents. Don't run away and not tell your parents where you're going for a month. That's not a good idea, no matter in which culture you are. And you have to have, conducted some of these reading programs yourself in the area that you're coming from. 300 people arrived. We booked, I don't know what the English word is. We have religious places where you have like dormitories. So a couple of the such places in the capital city were quite taken up with what this was and gave us a very cheap rate. So people would come in, stay for 2 days, there would be some orientation, and then they would move to these 150 locations. And literally what happened was these young people would take these older, mostly male master trainers to a nearby school. The first day was quite tough because these were master trainers. They had been training their whole life. They were teachers of a high order. There was nothing more left to learn. They knew it all. But to take them to a school and say, let's look at some children, 3rd to 5th grade, let's work with them for an hour, and let's do this over 10 days. And lo and behold, very soon, lunch was 15 minutes. This thing was 45 to 50 minutes. And actually, the fact that you could take people, work with them, I think being young helped, because the combination of the young versus the experience, the energy and the experience worked. If I had tried to do it, I'm sure it wouldn't have worked. But when there are young people saying, come on, let's just go try it, you begin to want to humor them. And we had, across all of these locations, firstly, not a single mishap. Very often there were 2 young girls and 40 elderly or older men who were the trainers. Everywhere people were taken very good care of, given gifts when they left. We were not paid, but I think we received back a great deal of warmth and friendship. And when this whole exercise ended, often people asked us, so did you work with the government? Is there sustainable change? Is this going to last? Very difficult questions. Did we work with the government, or did we just work with some people? Were we an organization, or were we individuals? Were there going to be sustainable change? Not immediately. Does change happen in a linear fashion? I mean, there were no easy answers to any of these. But I think what we did learn is that friendship and trust and warmth and seriousness goes a long way in persuading people to change their minds. In years afterwards, we've done a lot of work in this state, often with state governments, and in many cases, the relationships that were forged in those 10, 15 days have been leveraged really well to come up with the next round of things that we wanted to do. So, in wrapping up, she hasn't given me the note yet, but I can sense that I should wrap up. I think that we learned, as you can see, many things. Going to new places, meeting new people, doing new kinds of work is a huge learning. We learned that doors need to be kept open. There are all kinds of people who would like to help. They don't come in a prescribed fashion. And very often, working with young people, I find the bold ones, the ones who've had trouble, are often the best when it comes to pushing these kinds of frontiers. We have very often in Pratham no fine print. Our manuals or guidelines of action are not very detailed. But there is a clear framework of action. And I think for us, it's been very important to have some clear, visible goals that you feel are actually doable. Reaching for the stars is a good idea, but the stars are very far away. Reaching for the mango on the tree is a little bit easier as the first step. And I think that we have also come to see that not all progress is linear. You take a couple of steps forward, you take a few steps sideways, and you have to keep doing this. This business of development is not an explosion. It is a whole set of mixed up things, but as a huge movement, I think it's on a forward course. And we have to make sure that the waves move forward. And they do lap backwards, but that more and more that you go forward. The importance of policies are important, allocations are important, money is important. But I would say trust and taking people along is as important, if not more. Especially for people who work outside the government, we find that we can find resources in almost every community. But you have to look for them. You have to trust that there are people there who actually can help. And I think coming back to where I started, having done some of these things, I think gave us the confidence to carry out an effort like ASAR, which goes into every rural district in India. Because over the course of the years before that, we had learned that there are people everywhere who really want to make a change. And we feel very strongly, and we see this in the learnings we've had from many other friends and partners now in East Africa, in West Africa, in Pakistan, that these are quite similar and universal bonds. In every community, if there are young people, some of these young people want to make a change, and most young people want to be part of the change. And once young people in a country feel like they can make about a change, I think that's the way that the world moves forward. So I'm not sure, I thought I should say something about the main theme of this. But I think all of these things, as we move forward in education, there will be MDGs, but I think we need some local Gs as well. And I think these don't need to be either or. They really can be connected. And we have to believe and create opportunities. Often opportunities don't come. Platforms are not flat. They have to be created. Take the opportunity that you get and make what you can of it. Because as soon as you start making something happen of it, more happens than you think would have happened. So I took the opportunity when Karen asked me to come, and I hope that I have done what you wanted me to do. But thank you so much for having me come here.